Glory to Jesus Christ. Welcome to this conference on Vatican II and the Eastern Catholic Churches, as it were, Orientalium, ecclesiarum, that is the decree on the Eastern Churches 50 years later. Some of us were actually around 50 years ago. In fact, I think a fair number of us were actually around 50 years ago. My name is Peter Galadza. I'm the acting director of the Metropolitan under Sheptytsky Institute of Eastern Christian Studies at St. Paul University in Ottawa. You're in for a real treat. I am, well, it's not my opinion. This was actually confirmed by Rome itself, since Father Daley won the Ratzinger Prize a couple of years ago for theology. It was actually on the front page of the Osservatore Romano. And I mention that because he didn't put that in his bio, but this guy has not only met the Pope, the previous Pope personally, he actually got money from Pope Benedict. As they say, show me the money. The thank you card is really nice, but when you get the Ratzinger Prize for being an outstanding theologian, outstanding contemporary theologian, and they actually give you money, then you know it's quite outstanding. So our first speaker, as you have surmised by now, is Father Brian Daley. He's the Catherine F. Husking. Husking, is that how you pronounce it? You guys don't even know how it's pronounced. No, you know, I don't. Oh, it's Husking. Okay, so the I in there isn't pronounced. Anyway, the Catherine F. Husking, Professor of Theology at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. A 1961 graduate of Fordham University. That was even before Vatican II. He read Litterae Humaniores, which is classics in philosophy at Merton College at Oxford University in England. And he did that from 1961 to 64 as a Rhodes Scholar. And then he entered the Society of Jesus, so he's a Jesuit. After theological studies in Frankfurt, Germany, and ordination to the priesthood in 1970, he returned to Campion Hall, Oxford, to do a doctorate in the Faculty of Theology there, which he completed in 1978. Now you can tell that Father Brian studied in Germany for a while because already 4 days ago he sent me an email saying that he's finished his paper and that the paper will it'll take him about 55 or 56 minutes to read it. So okay, so this guy's into Ordnung, man. He's studied in Germany. Father then taught historical theology for 18 years at the Weston Jesuit School of Theology in Cambridge, Massachusetts, before moving to Notre Dame in 1996. He's the author of several books, among them The Hope of the Early Church, published by Cambridge University Press, On the Dormition of Mary, Early Patristic Homilies, published by St. Vladimir Seminary Press, Gregory of Nazianzus, published by Rutledge in 2006, which means that the book costs about $150, but that's okay. Brian is worth it. And of course, he's published several hundred scholarly articles. He's also the translator of Hans Urs von Balthasar's Cosmic Liturgy, The Universe According to Maximus the Confessor, published in 2003. He's the executive secretary of the Catholic Orthodox Consultation for North America and a member of the editorial boards of several scholarly journals. And he has served as a trustee of Le Moyne College, Boston College, Fordham University, and Georgetown University. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Father Brian Daley, who will speak on the Eastern Catholic Churches, a Roman Catholic perspective 50 years after the Vatican II decree on the Eastern Churches.
As we gather this weekend to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Second Vatican Council's decree on the Eastern Catholic Churches, it will be good to keep in mind, I think, that these churches have often, throughout their history, been what the Gospel says Jesus was called, a science of contradiction. Mistrusted, often vilified by their Orthodox counterparts as willing tools of the Western Church's imperialism, treated as poor and unenlightened stepchildren by their Latin Catholic patrons, the Eastern Catholic Churches, often rather disparagingly referred to on both sides as uniates, are regarded by many as the result of failed past attempts to restore church unity through separate deals between Rome and local Orthodox hierarchies, step by step and synod by synod, rather than by Rome and the whole Orthodox family coming together in a spirit of fraternal equality and respect. So as recently as 20 years ago, as you may remember, at the height of the tensions in Eastern Europe that followed on the breakup of the Soviet Empire, the International Orthodox Catholic Commission, meeting briefly at Freising near Munich in the summer of 1990, and then more at length at Balamand in Lebanon in June of 1993, officially stated that the Catholic Church has now, and I quote, disowned uniatism as a method in the search for unity, because it is opposed to the common tradition of our churches. Acknowledging the right of the historic Eastern Catholic churches still to exist, and to give continuing pastoral care to their own faithful, the Balamand statement, without ever defining exactly what it understands uniatism to be, nevertheless insists that developing this form of church structure can no longer be accepted as a method to be followed, nor as a model of the unity our churches are seeking. Uniatism, however you understand that, is officially over. In retrospect, most people now recognize that the Freising and Balamand statements of the Joint International Commission were written in anger, especially Orthodox anger, and were the expressions of an increasingly dysfunctional dialogue process that would by 2000 lapse into a 5-year silence, only to be reborn in 2005 under new leadership and with largely new members. Inflammatory media reports from Eastern Europe of small towns where Eastern Catholics, suppressed by the Soviet system since the late 1940s, forcibly retook churches that once had been theirs, but had been used by the Orthodox congregations for 50 years. Rumored horror stories of gangs of young ruffians in Western Ukraine interrupting the divine liturgy, or less violently, on the surface at least, stories of Polish Catholic nuns handing out holy cards of Our Lady of Fatima to unsuspecting Orthodox kindergartners, incensed well-intentioned Christians on both sides, and led many Orthodox bishops in the 1990s to argue again that the real obstacle keeping Eastern and Western Christians apart was Roman ecclesiastical imperialism, the thinly veiled attempt to proselytize and absorb the Eastern Christianity piecemeal. While the Uniate churches have stood this for over centuries. Though they never define it, these documents clearly mean by uniatism absorption and subordination, a surrender of identity. As Orthodox leaders have often put it informally, uniates were originally Orthodox Christians who surrendered their religious identity in order to win favor in the West. If they were honest, they would now either simply become Latin Catholics or else return to their Orthodox mother church that they'd abandoned. Largely at Orthodox insistence, the International Joint Commission was first led to disown uniatism as a way towards church reunion, and then stopped talking altogether. Perhaps the world after communism simply needed to catch its breath. But what really was being disowned? For much of the 20th century, Roman Catholics have often seen the Eastern Catholic or Uniate churches as a partial, gradual model of the kind of general reunion between East and West that Catholics have hoped and prayed for since the gradual hardening of schism in the early Middle Ages. The development of a relationship between at least one part of the Orthodox world and Western Catholicism, which involved agreement on the basic outlines of doctrine and sacramental practice, and the acceptance of the Pope's primacy by the Orthodox partners in practical terms, while reaffirming their ancient liturgical practices, monastic institutions, devotional and aesthetic traditions, and even their own theological vocabulary. Behind this lay the assumption that the Orthodox, in a different way from Protestants certainly, had broken away. The Eastern churches, united to Rome, offered a possible recipe for reconciliation and reunion, a still narrow bridge that might be broadened by patient dialogue and mutual education into a great highway. For Orthodox Christians, on the other hand, Eastern Catholics seemed to be trying to lead a double life. Having broken communion with their fellow Orthodox, they were simply going through the motions of Eastern liturgical and spiritual practices, while accepting papal centralization, canon law, the inevitable Latinization and thought and action that follows. To be really part of Eastern Christianity while being actively united with Rome seemed to most modern Orthodox a simple contradiction. So let me offer a few reflections. First, on the history of Eastern Catholic churches. To be fair, one must recognize that this form of church union is not a new occurrence. Just as what we think of as the East-West schism was doubtless a process of gradual alienation over several centuries, so attempts to repair and resume ecclesial communion between these two sides were made many times in various parts of the world, between the 12th century, when mutual excommunications in Constantinople brought frayed relations to dramatic expression, and the modern age. The Maronite Church, for example, whose monastic origins in the mountains of Lebanon, probably in the 5th or 6th century, are still not fully clear, which claims never to have been formally out of communion with the Pope and the Latin Church, explicitly reaffirmed its unity with the West as early as 1182, during the crusader invasions, and has remained part of the Catholic communion since then. At the Fourth Lateran Synod in 1215, a gathering on the heels of the infamous Fourth Crusade that brought to full expression the centralist ideology of the medieval Latin Church known as the Gregorian Reform, the Maronite Patriarch Jeremiah, the Syrian Orthodox Patriarch John, and a legate of Nicholas, the Chalcedonian Patriarch of Alexandria, are said to have attended. In one of his decrees, significantly entitled On the Arrogance, the Superbia of the Greeks towards the Latins, the Synod observed that since many Greeks were, quote, returning to the obedience of the Apostolic See, a phrase that already presumes an ecclesiology, the bishops here expressed the desire to preserve and honor the customs and rites of Eastern Christians as much as we can in the Lord, and to respect their existing patriarchal structures. But they insisted they must conform themselves as obedient children to the Holy Roman See. That's quote. At the Second Council of Lyon in 1274, attended by a dazzling array of representatives from all over the West, a union agreement was signed between the Latin and Greek Orthodox churches, in which the Orthodox agreed to the insertion of filioque in the Creed of Constantinople, and implicitly recognized Roman claims to jurisdictional primacy. This agreement was reached at the urging of the Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII Palaeologos, but soon was disowned by the hierarchy in Constantinople and led to the resignation of two successive patriarchs there. The other great medieval attempt to work out the reunion of Eastern and Western Christians was the Council of Florence. In its final phase, led by Pope Eugene IV, who died in 1445. With tendencies growing stronger among Western academic theologians to modify papal centralization by developing a working system of regular representative synods, and with the Byzantine Church eager to mend relations with the West under pressure from the growing Ottoman Empire, the possibilities for a reunion of Christendom seemed particularly strong. Although attendance by any of the churches was not numerous at Florence, separate theologically detailed covenants of union were signed between the Western Church and the Greek Orthodox Church in 1439, with the Armenian Apostolic Church, also in 1439, the Coptic and Ethiopian Orthodox churches in 1442, the Chalcedonian or Melkite Syrian Orthodox Church in 1444, and the East Syrian or Chaldean Church of what is today northern Iraq in 1445. While unity with the Maronite Church was again reaffirmed. But aside from small communities of reconciled Eastern Christians that were thus generated in these areas, most of Florence's agreements were non-starters. Greek monastic communities and the outspoken Bishop Mark of Ephesus, who had attended the council, refused to accept the agreements as binding, and the Church of Constantinople rejected them. 10 years later, the Greek capital fell to the Turks, and all such questions became moot. In 1553, a number of East Syrian bishops elected Yochanan Zoaka as patriarch, who took the name of Shimon VIII. He traveled to Rome to receive episcopal ordination from the Pope, thus again re-establishing communion with the Western Church. In 1681, Rome began referring to this northern Mesopotamian or Assyrian church, inaccurately, as the Chaldean Catholic Church, and has remained in union with Rome intermittently ever since. And meanwhile, the hierarchy of the West Syrian or Melkite Church, which continued to accept the Chalcedonian decrees and to use the Byzantine form of the liturgy, were between the 12th and 18th centuries also intermittently in communion with the bishops of Rome. In 1729, under the influence of Western missionary activity and, I must say, Jesuit educational initiatives, Patriarch Cyril Taunus also formally made a covenant of union with the Pope. And those churches that followed him are the ancestors of today's Melkite Greek Catholic Church, which Bishop Nicholas represents in our midst. Perhaps the best known to us in North America of the Eastern Catholic Churches, Catholic by doctrinal and canonical union with the Pope and the Western Church, but Eastern in liturgy, theology, and spirituality, are those in Western Slavic lands. The Ukrainian Catholic Church, formed after careful negotiations between the Orthodox Metropolitan of Kiev, Michael Rachosa, and many bishops of what then was Kiev and Rus, and the Latin Catholic authorities at the Synod of Brest in 1596. And the Slovak part of the Ruthenian Church from the Western or Austro-Hungarian side of the Carpathian Mountains, united with Rome at the Synod of Uzhhorod in 1646. Both these churches, representing virtually one people in language and ethnicity, have been strongly represented in North America since the 19th century, where in fact most Ruthenian Greek Catholics live today. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Roman attempts to standardize Catholic observance and forms of worship in all sorts of ways led to an increasing process of Latinization in most of these Eastern churches. Pope Benedict XIV, the great reformer of canon law and papal procedure, in a learned and well-documented encyclical of 1755, Allate Sunt, took steps to maintain the liturgical integrity of churches united with Rome, insisting that Latin priests and religious working in Eastern Christian regions should avoid any attempts to Latinize liturgies, to mix true rites, or to Westernize Eastern customs. Encyclicals in those days were really sets of canonical decisions. But the disparity of East and West in the relations of these churches with the Latin Church continued, as European nations also continued to expand their cultural and economic in these home regions. Western religious communities, men and women, established schools, hospitals, and seminaries. French became an educated language in Syria and Egypt, Polish in Ukraine, English in South India. Inevitably, many earnest Catholic religious working there came to see their mission in terms of religious as well as cultural amalgamation. In the time of Pope Pius IX, a time of growing distance between the Christian world and an increasingly secular European society, Rome seems to have seen its relations with the Eastern Catholic churches as a matter of reclaiming groups that had gone astray, as not as radically perhaps as the Protestant churches of the West, but deviant still in matters of substance. In 1862, the Vatican's Commission for the Eastern Rites officially decided that members of the Orthodox churches are validly baptized and do not need conditional baptism if they come into communion with the Catholic Church. A position, interestingly, that's still not fully reciprocated by all the Orthodox churches. In 1867, however, the Pope insisted that the new Armenian Catholic Patriarch not exercise jurisdiction before receiving the pallium at Rome, a policy that the Melkite and Maronite Patriarchs refused to accept as an implied limitation of the power of their synods to elect the Patriarch on their own. At the First Vatican Council, Maronite, Melkite, and Syrian Catholic Patriarchs urged an official policy of greater respect for their traditions, especially for the authority of patriarchs in their own churches and for monastic institutions, and urged that changes of rite, and so of church membership, by individuals again be discouraged In the press of business, their proposals were ignored by the council adjourned. The Melkite Patriarch Gregory Yusuf also expressed concern about Vatican I's dogmatic definition of papal infallibility as a new barrier to reconciliation with the Orthodox, and saw in the Council's Constitution on the Church, Dei Filius, evidence of the Western moves towards centralization. He argued that for the retention of some form of the classical Eastern idea of a patriarch, he argued for the retention of some form of the classical Eastern idea of a pentarchy, of apostolic sees, for which the supreme authority of the Bishop of Rome as Patriarch of the West was only to be exercised in the rest of the world in situations of extraordinary urgency. For the Roman Curia and most of the Council's bishops, however, it was difficult to conceive of the Catholic Church as anything but the hierarchical structure rejected by Protestants since the Reformation. And that, of course, was the Latin Church of the West. Pope Leo XIII, who succeeded to the Petrine office in 1879, seems to have been genuinely concerned to move Catholics away from some of the rigid attitudes on culture and theology, and thus also on Eastern Christianity, that had grown to characterize Rome under Pius IX. In November of 1894, just 120 years ago this fall, after holding what we would call a summit conference with the Eastern Catholic Patriarchs, he issued his own encyclical, Orientalium dignitas ecclesiarum, celebrating the historic importance of the Eastern Christian churches and strictly forbidding Western Catholics doing pastoral or educational ministries in the Eastern world to urge local people to become Latin Catholics. Yet despite what we might call the best ecumenical intentions, Leo's fulsome rhetoric in the letter still recalls the Counter-Reformation assumption that the Latin Church, under the Roman bishop, is the Catholic Church in its supreme fullness. Leo writes, "It has been most especially the habit of the Roman Church, the head of all the churches, to render to the Church of the East a great degree of honor and love in remembrance of the apostles, and to rejoice in her turn at their faithful obedience. Nor was it the last expression of her watchfulness that she guard and preserve in them, whole and entire forever, the customs and distinct forms for administering the sacraments that she had declared legitimate in her wise jurisdiction. Nothing else, perhaps, is so breathtakingly effective for illustrating the mark of Catholicity in God's Church than that striking sight of differing forms of ceremonies and noble examples of the tongues of the ancient past, made all the more noble by the use of the apostles and fathers, rendering their submission to the Church." The Eastern Catholic churches are clearly understood here simply in terms of Eastern rites, the cultural and spiritual forms that they preserve, curiosities, one might say, in the great museum of the Bishop of Rome. If one needs an illustration of what the Balamand statement was to reject as uniatism 100 years later, one arguably will find it here. The Western Church's grasp of the deeper reality of Eastern Christianity continued, however, to grow slowly. Pope Benedict XV set up a special congregation for the Eastern churches in 1917, and in the same year founded the influential Pontifical Oriental Institute in Rome for the academic study of Eastern Church history, theology, and literature, in which many of you have studied. Despite a strong overall resistance to ecumenical dialogue, his successor, Pius XI, made efforts to strengthen ties between Western and Eastern Catholic churches, and promoted the Catholic outreach also toward the Orthodox in his letter Rerum Orientalium of 1929. Catholic theologians cautiously but increasingly wrote about ecumenical issues, and gradually became involved in ecumenical dialogue in the 1930s and 40s. In 1949, they were given the green light under Pope Pius XII to do this officially. It was no surprise then that when a new pope, John XXIII, announced his plan to call together an ecumenical council of the Catholic Church in January 1960, both the relationship of Catholics to other Christians and other believers, and the place of the Eastern Catholic churches within the worldwide Catholic body were placed high on the proposed agenda. The question was how the assembled bishops, most of them Latin-Rite diocesan prelates, would approach such questions. And so, my second part on Vatican II. In the 2.5 years before the council met, suggestions were solicited from around the world, and preparatory commissions were hard at work in Rome, drafting documents that the bishops of the council might discuss. Membership in these commissions was understandably dominated by the Roman Curia and by theologians at the Roman universities. And the theological perspective, most of them, particularly on questions of church structure and liturgy, was clearly that of standard textbook scholasticism. By the spring of 1962, 2 partial drafts, or schemata, had been prepared on relations with the Orthodox, which the Central Theological Commission planned to integrate probably into a larger decree on Christian unity. One of them was on the possibility of sacramental sharing, communicatio in sacris in the Roman term, another on the Church's hope for, quote, the reconciliation of the Eastern dissidents. Just before the beginning of the Council, in October of 1962, a special commission under the chairmanship of Cardinal Amleto Cicognani, who had been apostolic delegate in Washington in the 1950s, and who was very much of the old curial style, I might say, was formed to prepare a possible separate document on the Eastern Catholic churches that would deal with these and other concerns. Its episcopal membership, originally 26 in all, was unusually diverse and included 13 Eastern Catholic bishops, half of the number, 6 of them patriarchs, and 6 bishops from the Latin Church in countries where there are numerous Eastern Catholics. The theological consultors represented a range of positions. 6 of them had special expertise in Eastern theology. Abbot Johannes Hug from Bavaria, from the Abbey of Scheiern, who was then abbot primate of the Benedictines and a reconciled expert on the theology of St. John of Damascus, was one of them. The bishop members of the full council had a chance to discuss a first draft of a document on the Eastern churches towards the end of that first session, from November 27th to 30th, 1962. A dominant role was played by several Melkite bishops who had jointly prepared their input beforehand. Addressing the general body of the council in French, as he always chose to do, rather than in the customary Latin, and this itself was a gesture, the 84-year-old Melkite Patriarch of Antioch, Maximus IV Said, pointed out on the first day of discussion that the draft needed to show more awareness that the Eastern Catholic churches are precisely that, churches in themselves, many of them of very ancient origin, and not simply branches of a worldwide corporation with its home office in Rome. I heard the same point made forcefully by, a few years later, by the then Bishop of Newton, Bishop Joseph Talia. Speaking of Eastern Christianity as a single phenomenon, Patriarch Maximus insisted, this church owes to the See of Rome neither its origin, nor its rights, nor its organization, nor anything what makes it concretely what it is. To put it briefly, nothing gave birth to its faith except the apostles. No one except the fathers established it in his whole patrimony of prayer, organization, and activity. Could one say that Saints Basil, Gregory, Cyril, and Chrysostom, and the rest were only second-rank Catholics because they were not Roman in all they received and left behind them? For Patriarch Maximus, the main issue that troubled him about the draft on Eastern churches, what he was convinced would make it once again a red flag for the Orthodox, was its unspoken presuppositions about what structures unify the church. So he continued, if one wants then to speak effectively to the Orthodox East, one must speak first of Catholic doctrine concerning the collegiality of the pastors of the church. And then he repeats that, the collegiality of the pastors of the church. Then one will talk about papacy, which will appear as the central foundation of this collegiality. This point is absolutely essential. It would be fatal to forget it. Shortly after the Patriarch made his comments, his younger colleague, Archbishop Elias Zogby, then the delegate of the Melkite Patriarchate in Egypt, spoke somewhat more forcefully in the same vein, reminding the gathering that the very imbalance of their own membership symbolized in the council ceremonies and rankings, tended to obscure the church's ancient episcopal structure. He invited his hearers to look around them in the council hall, where the Eastern bishops, and now I'm quoting, about 130 in all, are lost in an assembly of more than 2,000 fathers. While the Eastern patriarchs, bishops of the great apostolic sees, which in the great ecumenical councils on the faith played the principal role in association with the legates of the Pope of Rome, these Eastern patriarchs find themselves today, in the persons of these Eastern Catholic patriarchs, surrounded by this imposing gathering, but disappearing behind the sacred purple of 100 cardinals, who today are the honor of the Catholic Church, but who did not exist in those days. The Church has evolved, some will say. That is true. But it has only evolved on one side, without regard for those who, by the same will of Christ, are called to be part of it. Only as the Catholic Church recovers the awareness that the Eastern churches, unlike the Protestants, are not dissidents, but sister churches with the Latin Church of the West, of equal age and dignity, will the foundation be laid for genuine unity with them. The contributions to that first discussion of the draft on the Eastern churches seem to have had an effect, in broad terms, on the Council's deliberation, but it had less on the development of the draft itself. Abbot Hooke, who was part of the commission in his comments on Orientalium and ecclesiarum to the older of the Herder commentaries of Vatican II, points out that the commission was made up of busy bishops from many parts of the world who were not able to meet often between the sessions. As a result, most of the work of revising was left to the periti, the local experts, whose very different theological orientations made it hard for them to agree. Particularly contentious were the use of the term particular churches rather than rites, which some still favored. Also, the requirement that the individual faithful should remain in their own church of origin, and the questions of how much to re-emphasize the rights of the Eastern Catholic patriarchates, as well as of sacramental sharing with the Orthodox. Led by Cardinal Cicognani, a majority of the Commission's Episcopal members clung to the traditional Roman ecclesiology of centralization. Hooke complains that many of them, during the council itself, showed what he called, I quote, strikingly formalistic and legalistic attitudes when dealing with amendments or modi from the floor. As a result, little substantial revision was done in the draft during the winter and spring of 1963, and a drastically shortened version of it was submitted to the council just before its second session began that autumn, but it was not discussed that year at all, 1963. After further revision and abbreviation by the Commission in April 1964, a final text was sent to the full membership of the Council for study, and then was discussed in full session on October 15th and 19th and 20th of that year, just 50 years ago this week and the beginning of next week. It's October 17th. Most Latin bishops, even if caught up in the Council's spirit of renewal, seem to have been somewhat hesitant to comment negatively on the draft, not wanting to appear unsympathetic to churches of which they knew little. The Maronite bishop Michel Dumit of Saba in Lebanon and the Coptic Catholic Patriarch Stephen Sidarus spoke critically of it and suggested abandoning the idea of a decree on the Eastern Catholic churches altogether. And the Melkites, also largely unhappy with the draft, argued that it would still be worthwhile for the council to say something. Again, Patriarch Maximus spoke with quiet but commanding authority, pointing out that the draft in its prologue seemed to contrast the Catholic Church with the very Eastern churches it was praising, and to suggest that the whole church, as led by the successor of Peter, is simply the Latin communion. He concluded, "We must not close the circuit of Catholicism on a dynamic, triumphant Latinity on one side, and on a fraction more or less weak of the Eastern world, assimilated and absorbed on the other. We must leave the circuit open. Let us shape a Catholicism true to its solemn affirmations, to its definition of Catholic as meaning universal. Let us make the house large enough not just for the small number that one invites in who belong to the family. Let us imagine it as a large, beautiful, and noble dwelling, Let us build it large enough, not just for us humble people and our communities who are blessed to be in communion with Rome, but so that all the original churches will be able to see themselves there. But it is in fact as large as it needs to be in the realization of love, as large as the universe. Yves Congar, who attended this discussion as a theological expert, observed, like many of the bishops, that the draft on the Eastern churches was disappointing in some ways, but that had opened the door, at least, to new ways of thinking. Here I quote from his Journal of the Council. It should have been a first major application of the new ecumenical policies. In fact, people have criticized it for not being ecumenical enough, even though it contains many good things. It seems, in fact, to consider the Eastern churches as annexes of a Catholic church practically identified with its Latin part, whose active missionary outreach has realized a material or practical universality. The church needs to get used to breathing again with its two lungs. I wonder if that's the origin of Pope John Paul's famous phrase. The church needs to get used to breathing again with its two lungs, also on the level of its ecclesiology. The schema on the Eastern churches, useful in spite of these failings because of the many excellent proposals it makes, should contribute to a movement of expansion with which everything now demands. The Council has made several attempts in this direction, which could have great significance. The ecclesiology that it is formulating, with the new breadth and depth that have been signaled, the doctrine of episcopal collegiality, consonant with the synodal organization tradition in the East, the restoration of the authority of the patriarchs and their role, which as Beatitude Maximus IV defended in an intervention with nobility and power, impressed everyone. The new regulations for communicatio and sacraments between Orthodox and Catholics. After 3 days of debate and a chance for further small textual revisions, the decree on the Eastern churches, seen by most people as the best compromise text possible at the time, was accepted by an almost unanimous vote of the Council on November 21st, 1964. What did it actually contain? Its intention, according to the opening paragraph, is to express the whole Church's esteem and special care for the Eastern churches united with Rome, by articulating some guiding principles, as it says, for their self-government. It then begins by attempting to define the different groups that together constitute the worldwide Catholic body. The Holy Catholic Church, which is the mystical body of Christ, it says, is made up of the faithful who are organically united in the Holy Spirit by the same faith, the same sacraments, and the same government, and who, coming together in various hierarchically linked different groups, thus form particular churches or rites. Between these churches, there is such a wonderful communion that this variety, so far from diminishing the church's unity, rather serves to emphasize it. The conception of the church is sketched out here, which appears in many of the Council's documents, and has become a common feature of ecumenical and ecclesiological reflection in the last several decades. The notion of a social or human unity rooted in, even enhanced by, the diverse groups that make it up. The Church itself is described in these opening lines as a worldwide organic union of particular churches, and the Latin phrase is ecclesiae particulares. Christian communities bound together inwardly, one assumes, by place or language or ethnic character, and linked with each other by the Holy Spirit through a sharing of common faith, welcoming each other's members in their sacraments, and being regulated by common structures of government. The Church as a universal community, a movement, is made up of these particular churches, a term presumably crafted to be more flexible and adaptable than local churches or national churches would be, as they are held together in a wonderful communion, mira communione, a key concept used in several of the Council's documents, to which we will return shortly. The Church, in its most general sense, as used by Catholics, is not simply the general name for everyone who hears the gospel and believes it, as one often finds in evangelical usage, but an organized body with a particular shape, a gathering of sacramental communities, each with its own character, but held together by faith and the life-giving symbols and rites that shape its social character, as well as by a complex system of authority that allows for variety while maintaining order. It is, as some have said, a communion of communions, a church of churches. In Catholic parlance, particular churches with characteristic traditions of liturgy and spirituality have come to be called rites, and are held together not only by their common biblical faith, but by the overarching ministry of the Bishop of Rome, the successor of Peter, whose universal role, as Pope John Paul II would later emphasize in Ut Unum Sint, is above all to serve the communion of the churches. Within that communion of particular churches, however, as Orientalium and ecclesiarum emphasizes in section 3, all of the churches are equal in dignity and rank. All enjoy the same integrity. They are not simply different local branches of the same centralized organization. They are churches in their own right, churches that find the fullness of their own identity in union with each other. Communion with other Catholic churches enables each of them to be fully what it is. Because of this primary particularity of the church, the decree urges each particular church to, as it says, organize its own parishes and hierarchy. Bishops of these churches should meet regularly in provincial and national synods, enact local regulations, take charge of the formation of their own clergy. Section 4. The old Catholic principle of church membership since the time of Benedict XIV is here reaffirmed. Every believer, including those who come to full Catholic communion as adults, should remain in the particular church or rite in which he or she first became part of the whole Catholic world. Even if one regularly participates in the worship and cultural life of other Catholic communities, one remains canonically rooted in one's church of origin. To change rite, to be transplanted into another particular Catholic church, requires the permission of higher church authorities, the Holy See, or someone designated by it to supervise such changes. Section 4. The second, longer part of the decree is focused on the practical implications of this understanding of the church as both universal and particular, with special reference to the Eastern Catholic churches and the preservation of their particular and diverse heritage. Here in Chapter 5, the document insists emphatically that the liturgical, structural, and spiritual traditions of these communities are not simply theirs, but belong to the whole church. So it repeats emphatically now, in the case of the Eastern Catholic churches, what it already implied in a general way. And this paragraph is almost verbatim taken over in the decree on ecumenism. For that reason, it says, this council solemnly declares that the churches of the East, like those of the West, have the right and duty to govern themselves according to their own special disciplines. For these are guaranteed by ancient tradition and seem to be better suited for the customs of the faithful and better fitted to bring about the good of their souls. This is then applied to various facets of everyday Christian life. The Eastern Catholic churches are to cultivate their own authentic liturgies in forms true to their origins and historical development. Get rid of Latinization, and to see to the instruction of priests and educators, even those originally from other traditions, to train by ritual celebrants, for instance, in how to celebrate and interpret their liturgies. The great patriarchies by which the ancient particular churches have long organized and governed themselves on a regional and linguistic basis should be recognized as autonomous within the framework of worldwide communion. The sacramental disciplines traditionally cultivated in particular Eastern churches should be allowed to flourish. Catholics from other churches in communion with them are allowed to receive the sacraments in these distinctive forms. And marriages between Eastern Catholics and Orthodox, when performed by an Orthodox priest, should be regarded as valid, even without dispensation. Liturgical calendars and feasts are to be regarded by the patriarchs, regulated rather by the patriarchs and their synods. The closeness of Catholic and Orthodox traditions is then emphasized, as well as the special role of the Eastern Catholic churches as bridge builders with the larger Christian East. Orthodox Christians who desire to enter the Catholic communion may be received through a simple profession of faith, and those in holy orders do not need to be reordained. Finally, because the Catholic Church recognizes their sacraments as valid, a limited form of sacramental sharing with the Orthodox churches is to be permitted from the Catholic point of view. Orthodox Christians may receive the sacraments of the Eucharist, reconciliation, and the anointing of the sick from Catholic priests in case of need if they freely ask for them. And at least as far as the Catholic Church is concerned, but generally not, as you know, the Orthodox churches, Catholics may do the same in cases where a Catholic priest is not easily available. All these practical rules for East-West relations, in fact, are explicitly set out in this decree as provisional measures. All these legal arrangements that the decree points out in its final section are made in view of the present conditions, until such time as the Catholic Church and the separated Eastern churches, the Orthodox, unite together in the fullness of communion. The hope behind this decree is clearly that in time there will no longer be a need for distinctively Eastern Catholic churches at all, but that Eastern and Western Christians of all traditions will be joined in a single, diverse, and unified body, all Catholic, all self-governing, all united by faith, sacraments, and mutual recognition. So in conclusion, a few reflections. As we reflect on Orientalium ecclesiarum 50 years later, after it was finished, I think at least two things stand out in the text for all its admitted unevenness. First, it clearly is built on the ecclesiology of communion that was such a recurrent theme in the Council's documents, and which had a truly revolutionary implications for the Catholic Church's understanding of itself. And second, it hints at a new understanding of a distinctive mission, even a divine vocation, for the Eastern Catholic churches, whose origins and progress had through the centuries shown so many variations. Let me develop these ideas a bit further. First of all, communion. The notion of communion, communio, koinonia in Greek, is a fairly widespread way of speaking about human unity in the ancient world. The central idea seems to be that of a unity among individuals based on their sharing together in some common gift. A meal, for instance, or music or dance, or if you're a Platonist, the way individual things share a universal identity by participating in it. The term suggests that the unity felt is not simply convention, not something deliberately constructed by those who share it, as postmodernists might say, not simply functional or practical, like the unity of a business corporation, but is rather based on the discovery of some prior universal blessing, some defining common good that binds otherwise disparate people together. In the early church, the community often referred to itself as being or as entering into and maintaining a communion. Here, the common blessings that bound Christians together were the apostolic faith they had received, whatever their backgrounds, the gift of the Holy Spirit, a sharing of material goods among all in the community, and the Eucharist, which became the center of community prayer and life. One need only think of those beautiful passages in Acts 2 or Acts 4 that present us with a picture, I think, of what people understood as communion. As the first centuries went on, the vision of the church offered in the early chapters of Acts became the model for how the community around the world was generally conceived. The letters of St. Ignatius of Antioch, for instance, from the early 2nd century, whose feast we're celebrating, at least in the Roman Church today, attest to communities in Syria and Asia Minor in which the prime reality of Christian community life was not so much a worldwide movement as a local gathering around the Eucharistic table. People hearing the word of Scripture in the Gospels, guided by a single supervisor, episkopos, and his group of elders, his presbytery, actually served in a liturgy and also in their social needs by ministers, diaconi, who seem to have included women as well as men. This early way of conceiving the church has been developed again and again by some modern Orthodox and Catholic theologians who have found in it the inspiration for what is sometimes called a Eucharistic ecclesiology, focused on the local community of the church as the primary reality. A number of Catholic theologians have pointed out that this needs to be balanced, both historically and theologically, against the consciousness that's also evident in early Eucharistic prayers, in the work of Irenaeus and letters of Cyprian, and a host of other pre-Nicene documents, of the local church's need for unity with other communities throughout the world. This implied, among other things, a concern to share confessions of faith with church communities elsewhere, to pray for their bishops as well as one's own, to receive their members at the local Eucharist if they should travel. All of this complex set of relationships, person with person, church with church, province with province, region with region, came to be seen varyingly but increasingly through the 4th to 7th centuries as in some way held together by the supervisory concern of the Bishop of Rome, presiding in the church where Peter and Paul lay buried. His role was to reaffirm apostolic tradition, to remind the churches of the regulations they had enacted, to respond to appeals and disputes between bishops that could not be resolved at the regional level. One can see much evidence of this in Pope Leo's letters from the 440s and 450s. This understanding of the church, founded and willed by Christ, as first of all a differentiated yet unified sacramental communion of individuals, local communities, and regional bodies, appears in a number of places in the documents of the Second Vatican Council. One might say that its appearance there, inspired no doubt by the work of a number of mid-20th century European theologians who represented the so-called ressourcement in the Catholic thought, is the root of the revived conception of the Church that lies behind so many of the changes in modern Catholic life. So the Constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium, emphasizes the worldwide reality of the Church precisely as a self-conscious unity of diverse peoples. It is this communion within variety that makes it Catholic. Within this unified body, local congregations celebrating the Eucharist genuinely realize the presence, as it says, of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church of Christ. This is also the basis for what it calls the collegial character and structure of the order of bishops, something that Patriarch Maximus so emphasized, in virtue of which episcopal synods make decisions for the order and well-being of a province, a region, or the whole Christian body. Yet this collective responsibility for the universal church, vested in those who represent and guide its local embodiments, needs to be carried out precisely in a structured communion that by ancient Christian tradition finds its center and focus, its personal guarantee of unity in the ministry of the Roman bishop, in communion with the Pope, as we say in ecclesiastical shorthand. The Pope's role is not necessarily to control life in the scattered communities, as Father Taft says, to boss people around, or to legislate for local churches, or to appoint their bishops. But it is, as Pope Leo reminds us in many letters, to be the voice of the apostolic tradition, the conscience of the whole body. So Lumen Gentium expresses this dialectic of collegiality and papal responsibility. The Roman pontiff, it says, as the successor of Peter, is the perpetual and visible source and foundation of the unity both of the bishops and of the whole company of the faithful. Individual bishops are the visible source and foundation of unity in their own particular churches, which are modeled on the universal church. It is in and from these that the one and unique Catholic Church exists. And for that reason, each bishop represents his own church, whereas all of them, together with the Pope, represent the whole church in a bond of peace, love, and unity. That's Lumen Gentium 23. A letter of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith on the Church as Communion from May 1992, written under the guidance of then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, emphasizes the complexity of this concept, which, it says, lies at the heart of the Church's self-understanding. Communion, as the New Testament and Christian tradition understand it, is both a vertical and a horizontal reality, it says. That betrays, incidentally, the hand of the then Cardinal Ratzinger, who loves to talk about vertical and horizontal things. It is a gift of God realized in the sacraments, which forms a new relationship among human beings. The Church is fundamentally more than just a federation of local, independent communities, just as it is more than a single centralized organization enforcing discipline and uniformity in the branches. In this analogous meaning of the concept of communion, one can think of it as implying and interweaving both universal and local dimensions. Citing Pope John Paul, the letter speaks of the particular churches insofar as they are part of the one Church of Christ, as having what it calls a special relationship of mutual interiority with the whole, that is, with the universal church. Because in every particular church, the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church of Christ is present and active. Indeed, the letter suggests, citing a few second-century fathers, that the universal church is a gift that precedes all human making, shared in by local communities, but not simply constructed by them or exhausted by them. It is, as it says again, in its essential mystery, a reality ontologically and temporally prior to every individual particular church. It is the gift of the Spirit that descends at Pentecost, the changing form of the redeemed people of God throughout history. The mystery, as Paul writes, which is Christ in you, your hope of glory. In the context of the Second Vatican Council, then, it is significant that Orientalium ecclesiarum speaks of the Eastern Catholic churches not as branches of the Roman firm or as variations on the Catholic theme, but as churches in communion, as particular churches in themselves, celebrating the Eucharist of Jesus in their own languages and liturgical forms, but also as the one Catholic Church in a particular place and form, united to the other Catholic churches, and to the Catholic Church as a reality that somehow overarches and precedes all its components by the one faith, by mutual recognition, mutual prayer, and a common mission. They are, with the Latin Church that's usually designated as Catholic today, constitutive of the Catholic reality. The Church of Christ throughout the world cannot live in all its richness without any of them. Second, somewhat briefer point. In the context of an ecclesiology of communion, then, it seems important to look again at the statement of the Balamand Declaration that uniatism, as a way of working towards unity, has now been disowned because it is opposed to the common tradition of our churches. If by uniatism one understands the co-opting of Eastern local churches and individual Christians to become Roman Catholics in Eastern disguise, pretending to maintain at least something of Orthodox Christianity's liturgy and spirituality, while they subordinate themselves to a central westernized church and accept the control of the Roman Curia, then surely Balamand does represent the desire and the official theological position of both the Orthodox and Catholic churches today. But if one takes uniatism more broadly, as I would hope to do, more in the spirit of the Second Vatican Council and its decrees on the Church, on ecumenism, and on the Eastern Catholic churches, then Balamand is at least misleading and at most wrong. We do not use the U word today, we might say, perhaps. But what we seek on both sides of the East-West conversation is communion, union in faith and practice, mutual acceptance and recognition by churches that are genuinely sisters in a single rich tradition, a union expressed most concretely and efficaciously in the Eucharist we share. Uniatism, in that sense, a reaffirmed complex unity in the midst of a revered variety, is at the origin of these churches and is indeed the goal we strive for. In this more positive sense of uniatism, or reconciled diversity, to borrow a phrase from the wider ecumenical movement in Cardinal Caspary, we can even see a special role, a providential vocation from God in the life and witness of the Eastern churches in communion with Rome today. As we have mentioned, Vatican II's decree on the Eastern Catholic churches ends by explicitly declaring that the measures laid down concerning them in the document are only intended to be transitional ones until such time as the Catholic Church and the separated Eastern churches unite together in the fullness of communion. The Eastern Catholic churches, in other words, are thought of here as pointing the way beyond their present status in a renewed Catholicism to the full communion of Eastern and Western Christianity. So in his encyclical Orientalium, celebrating the centenary of Leo XIII's letter of 1895, Orientalium Dignitas, Pope John Paul II communicated a strikingly different attitude, without saying so, than that letter of Leo's did, despite Leo's benign intentions towards the liturgy, spirituality, and institutions of Eastern Christianity. emphasizing strongly how much Western Christians need to learn from their Eastern brethren. Union alone can fully realize the process of our mutual fertilization, and unity depends first of all on God, and then on our desires. We wait for both. Of course, Pope John Paul writes, in today's outlook, it appears that true union is possible only in total respect for the other's dignity, without claiming that the whole array of uses and customs in the Latin Church is more complete or better suited to showing the fullness of correct doctrine. And again, this union must be preceded by an awareness of communion that permeates the whole church and is not limited to agreement among our leaders. To reach that point, he agrees, a change of heart, what he calls love, sensitivity, and creativity, will be required in all of us. But it will not require us to abandon what we might call the instinct behind Uniatism, the Eastern Church's age-long desire, as he says, for ecumenical union. Let me quote again from that encyclical of John Paul II. The Eastern churches which entered into full communion with Rome wished to be an expression of this concern according to the degree of maturity of the ecclesial awareness of that time. In entering into Catholic communion, they did not at all intend to deny their fidelity to their own tradition, to which they had borne witness down through the centuries with heroism, often by shedding their blood. And if sometimes in relation with the Orthodox churches, misunderstandings and open opposition have arisen, we all know that we must ceaselessly ask for the divine mercy and a new heart capable of reconciliation, said by Pope Francis. A constant shared conversion is indispensable for them to advance resolutely and energetically towards mutual understanding. And conversion is also required of the Latin Church, that she may respect and fully appreciate the dignity of Eastern Christians and accept gratefully the spiritual treasures of which the Eastern Catholic churches are the bearers for the benefit of the entire Catholic community. Thus far, Pope John Paul. To see the Eastern Catholic churches, the uniates, to use that discredited term, not as opportunists or hapless victims, but as a sign of hope and a call for continued ecclesial and ecumenical change, is the challenge of Pope John Paul and the invitation of Orientalium ecclesiarum 50 years ago. Typically, perhaps, the Melkite Catholic Patriarch Maximus IV made the same point during the first session of the Council, more pointedly, but more simply. For us in particular, he says, Eastern Catholics have a Byzantine rite. The division of the churches is a wound that is always bleeding, one that we feel at the deepest level of our souls. The union of the churches is our greatest concern, our first preoccupation, the most burning desire in our hearts. It is the goal towards which we strive with all our energy, and we want to be a redemptive sacrifice for it until it is realized. To work for the union of the churches is, one could say, our raison d'etre, and the fundamental mission with which Providence has charged us as individuals and as communities. The purpose of what has been called Uniatism, Patriarch Maximus was saying, is nothing less than ecumenical understanding and reunion, the healing of those ancient wounds of mind and heart. In that sense, the real goal of Uniatism is end in the classical use of that term, and the real agenda of Orientalium ecclesiarum is something that's still to be achieved. Thank you very much.
We have about 10 minutes for Q&A. Unfortunately, we don't have a mic out there, but actually that may force people to actually pose questions as opposed to doing another lecture. So I'm going to be moderating this discussion, and you need not identify yourself unless you teach at the Sheptytsky Institute and therefore want to promote our brand, in which case we encourage you to identify yourself as someone associated with the Sheptytsky Institute. But please, I'm sure we've got two ladies before gentlemen. So Anastasia, please. And you just get up and maybe speak in that direction. I'm sure we'll hear you up here.
I noticed that in your presentation of the communion ecclesiology, you were saying that the center of the communion is the Bishop of Rome, or the Pope. But when we say we're looking for unity, let's say with the Russian Orthodox Church, we don't say we're looking for unity with the Russian Patriarch. Is this just some kind of semantical difference? Or is this some kind of favoring on the part of Latin Church to speak about communion with Pope rather than communion with the Church of Rome?
Well, I would say that it's a distinctively Catholic understanding of communion, which probably would not be acceptable to most Orthodox theologians. And I think that aspect of the theology of communion is still developing. I mean, I think a number of Orthodox theologians, I think of Metropolitan John of Pergamon, would say today that some kind of functional leadership and focus in the communion of churches appears to be necessary to prevent constant division and splits. But it doesn't have to be exercised in the way that the Pope of Rome has exercised it, clearly not. But I think both, if one accepts the idea that the papacy would exercise a very different kind of leadership in the churches that are not of the Latin communion and in those that are, and a different again in Italy or in the West, say, than in Africa, then I think one can perhaps move towards that. But I think it is part of the Catholic understanding that a sense of the representative guiding role of the Bishop of Rome is part of the constitution of the community. I think one finds that, say, in classical representation of people like Pope Leo and so on. And I fully understand that not all Orthodox theologians would accept that at this point. We have to find a way of conceptualizing it better.
And Father Bob Berenger, please.
At several points you made reference to churches in their own place. And of course, from the perspective of North America, particularly with the Ukrainian Catholic Church, this has been the point of tension, that the Latin bishops, from an earlier point, have always understood that this is our place, not their place. In a world in which anyone can be anywhere, and you yourself mentioned the Ruthenian presence more in North America than in its traditional homeland, does place mean, can it possibly mean anymore, what was still taken for granted in Orientalium?
Thanks. Well, clearly not. And this is, I think, a challenge for all of us. I mean, for each of our churches, and also for ecumenical conversation. I mean, I always think maybe we have to redefine place as where you're at, to use modern, jargon. But we see this even, certainly in the Roman Catholic Church, that people attend a parish where they feel at home, where they like the preaching, whatever it is. But they're with cars, they're willing to travel. And so one is not simply in a geographical area. And that creates problems for jurisdiction and so on, for conceiving the church. But it's evolving, I think. But then you get a place like North America, South America, Australia, where you have many different immigrant peoples overlapping with each other. And so you have them coming with their Christian traditions, Orthodox, Eastern Catholic, all sorts of groups, occupying the same place geographically. How do we think that? And it creates a great problem for someone like John Zizioulas, who doesn't know how to fit that into his Eucharistic ecclesiology. But we have to think, I think, less locally and more in terms of history, relationships, identification, and seeing what particular churches are. That, again, is under evolution, I think, today in the church.
Someone back there who's Professor Richard Schneider.
I used to teach Sheptytsky.
Yes. Bravo.
I would like to comment on the question of the centrality of the papacy from the point of view of the hermeneutic of understanding authority as power, because this has been the prevailing mindset of bishops, and by the way, not just Latin bishops. It's equally true of Orthodox bishops. For centuries and centuries, it's really a trend, and it's inherent in the decree. So that you look at, right after the decree uses this wonderful language that you brought out, Clause 3, defines the pastoral guidance of the Pope as his direction, and Clause 7 is talking about patriarchs, and ends with patriarchs are under the primacy of the Pope, which effectively turns patriarchs into metropolitans. So what's going to be required is to get out of the 6th century long fight with conciliarism,
Right.
and instead totally redefine primacy in non-power terms. Do you think this is even remotely possible? This has been the debate as far back as Balamand was 50 years ago on the primacy of Jesus.
Well, we're not there yet, clearly, and I think we have to admit that. And as Pope John Paul was always ready to say, we have to repent and be converted on all sides. We have to rethink how we understand power, and power is so sensitive in the modern world. I mean, not just in the church, in the religious thing, that it's a sensitive nerve. But I think a lot of these problems are post-12th century, and they're kind of modern. As the Western world evolved in a certain structural direction with empire and papacy, you have the definition of papacy, not simply in religious terms, but also in terms of jurisdiction. A lot of which was needed at the time, and may still be, but the Pope becomes more and more the one who makes decisions for the outlying regions, appoints bishops in the 19th century. And if you look at the early church, that was not the way things happened or were done. My hero in a lot of this is Leo I, who is a great person, a great rhetorician and writer, but who had a notion of his authority as Bishop of Rome that was very strong for him. I mean, he was kind of fighting a lot of battles at once. But at the same time, he realized that it was in terms of auctoritas and not in potestas, as the Latins would say. It was in terms of what he represented. And his job, his responsibility, being where Peter's bones were, was to speak as far as he understood it, the faith of Peter and the faith of Paul. He couldn't, change canons from other churches, but he could try to intervene in a dispute like Chalcedon and enunciate or articulate what he saw as the church's tradition. And it's interesting that even though there's no universal notion of papal authority in a juridical sense in those days, you find people in these disputes often, not always, appealing to someone like Leo as somebody's got to help us. You have to step in because Patriarch of Constantinople, or wherever it is barking up the wrong tree. The emperor is coercing us. So Theodorate of Cyrus, the 5th century bishop near Antioch, writes Leo a very pathetic letter saying, you have to do something. You're the Bishop of Rome. Well, there's a certain understanding here, but it's not the understanding of the Codex of Canon Law. And so how do you redefine that in the modern world, which has very different understandings of power? I don't know. I think we all have to work on this. But we all have to work at it together, the different churches.
You spoke about Trent twice, I think, as a watershed moment in the self-understanding of the Latin Church as itself being the Catholic Church. What's the difference?
Vatican I, it doesn't matter.
Okay, well then maybe my question is pointless, but what was the difference? I thought you were emphasizing Trent, and I was curious what the difference was between Trent, perhaps, and Lyon or Florence.
Well, the point was that I think after the Reformation, after the dispute with Luther and Calvin and all those guys, what was under attack, if you want, was an understanding of church, of practices, pastoral practices, sacraments, authority also. That was very much that of the Western Latin world. And so what the Protestants were protesting against, if you want, was the Latin Church in the late medieval period. And I think when the Catholic Western Church looks at its relation with the Orthodox or with Eastern Catholics, it's dealing with a very different set of questions. And so to speak about Orthodox Christians as dissident, in the same sense that, say, Lutherans or Baptists are dissident, is inaccurate. I mean, they don't define themselves as being non-Catholic, whereas for many Protestants, what defines them is they're Christians, but they're not Catholics. There's kind of a Hegelian dialectic going on there that isn't there in dealing with the Eastern churches. I remember, this may be irrelevant, but when I was teaching in Fordham a few years ago, a young man who was given to me as my assistant had been brought up as an evangelical Protestant in Arkansas. Great guy. He was doing patristics. And he was going on Sundays, most of the time, to an Orthodox church and thinking about becoming Orthodox. And he said to me, I can see myself becoming Roman Catholic too. And I have no problem with that. But he said, if I go back to Arkansas and tell my parents I'm becoming Orthodox, they say, what's that? And if I went back to town becoming a Catholic, they disown me. And that's kind of the reality in many parts of the Anglo-Saxon culture. There's a kind of a defining oneself as not that with Protestants. That is not the case with Orthodox Christians. Patriarch Maximus again points that out in some of his speeches at Vatican II, that whatever separates Catholics and Orthodox, it's not what separates Protestants and Catholics. And so that, in that sense, Trent comes into it a lot because it's representing Western tradition to those who reject Western tradition. But what's going on with the Orthodox Church is really more, it has certainly doctrinal elements to it, but it's mainly a question of church life and how it's expressed in communion.
Please join me in accepting Paul Brown. Say it all. Thank you again, Father Brian.